By now, if you haven't seen Breaking Bad, well, what are you doing? I mean, seriously? What? No, but really, if you haven't seen Breaking Bad, you've missed out on the cornerstone of television for the last decade. A decade which was dominated by the conversation of what a TV show really is, and maybe, more importantly, how it can be watched. For example, ask yourself, do you even need a TV anymore to watch TV? Or is there really even any difference between a feature-length movie and a segmented series? Here's looking at you, Twin Peaks. Also a key influence on the thematic approach, and especially the surreal nature of Breaking Bad. What started out as a small-time cult favorite on basic cable soon blossomed into the fascination of many avid binge watchers in the budding age of streaming. Netflix played a huge role in giving Breaking Bad a new life on demand, and in growing it into the phenomenon that it was and still is to this day. It was largely the help of the internet and word of mouth that led to the show's rise in popularity, but you had to see it to believe it, much like the myth of Heisenberg himself. Although it spent many years as television's best-kept secret, it's now impossible to think of a more original, more groundbreaking, or more iconic and referenced work this decade. Nothing has cast a longer shadow over the future of narrative television. The essential Breaking Bad is the narrative of modern television in and of itself. Most shows don't have a well-defined roadmap beyond a general idea, but all thanks to one big plot contrivance. It's the cancer, by the way. Breaking Bad more or less knew its beginning, middle, and end from its genesis, and this would come to be its greatest strength throughout the run. What initially attracted viewership was creator Vince Gilligan's now infamous pitch for the show, which centered around the premise of turning quote-unquote Mr. Chips into Scarface. And while this might seemingly give away the majority of the plot and even make it sound formulaic, what only the loyal fans from day one recognized was that it wasn't so much about the destination itself as it was about the journey. We might have, at times, known or at least strongly suspected what was going to happen next, but thanks to the incredible writers and the urgency conveyed by the actors themselves, we were always on the edge of our seats waiting to find out how dark it could really get. As they say, it's not about how you start, but how you finish. Game of Thrones and so many other shows this decade. And Breaking Bad finished out on top, alright. It ended up defining a decade of television and how to market it. Even though the show ended early on in the decade, 1/3 of the way through to be exact. The final season saw the greatest jump in viewership that any program in modern history had seen, with the average audience numbers doubling from the previous masterclass of a season. Gains of several million unique cable subscribers were tuning in from episode to episode down the final stretch during the closing episodes, and this ushered in the great send-off and showed an insatiable interest for the show that sadly should have been there from the very start. But in the end, Breaking Bad Season 5 cemented itself and the show into the history books. With a Metacritic score of 99, Season 5 entered the one and only Guinness Book of World Records as the most acclaimed show in history, only adding to its prestige and mystique. Many people praised Ozymandias as the best written episode in TV history, the best dramatic episode ever, and quite possibly just the best episode, period. The critics were satisfied, but more importantly, fans both new and old were elated. While Breaking Bad was clearly influenced by shows like The Sopranos and even fellow network masterpiece Mad Men, and wouldn't have been made possible without them, Breaking Bad did something better than the best serialized dramas in the Pantheon, or any other show for that matter. No, I'm not saying that Breaking Bad is hands down the best TV show ever, or even that it's the best drama, or even that it has the best central character or ensemble cast. I think that The Sopranos and Mad Men had both of those respectively. And although you might argue that Tony Soprano is still the prototypical antihero, or that Don Draper is the most enigmatic character in the history of the small screen, yes, I said it, certainly no antihero has gone further into the heart of darkness than the one and only Walter White. No antihero has had more of an impact on the lives of everyone around them. Walter and his alter ego Heisenberg essentially destroyed everything in wake, much like the plague, or quite literally the cancer he was diagnosed with. Walter's misdeeds spread all throughout the city of Albuquerque and beyond, tarnishing everything that was once good and wholesome. Certain key parallels exist between Breaking Bad and its precursors. Weeds, for example, was a darkly comical show about a matriarch dealing drugs under the radar just to support her family. In The Sopranos, Tony Soprano exerted his boss status authority to navigate his organization through troubled waters. It was his mastery of manipulation, his overbearing insistence on control, and the physical muscle he exerted that enabled him to tie up loose ends. In Mad Men, Don Draper's fairy tale facade, his predilection for lying and deceiving, particularly to his own family, became the essential elements to the chemistry of Walter White. These are the tried tropes of the modern anti-hero. All three of these men break the trust and severely damage their marriages and jeopardize their families, all in the pursuit of self-realization. Every anti-hero has to keep up appearances, set a few doubters straight, or even crack a few heads, but each one of them has a different method of taking care of business. For Tony Soprano, it was the brawn. For Don Draper, it was the suave fabrication of lies. And for Walter, it was mostly the brain. Or really, as I like to think of it, the bluff. But all of them had in common a level of narcissism and sociopathy they operated with. Walter's ego, however, was on another level entirely. This is the main attribute, the fact that carries the narrative forward. Almost everything that Walter does can be boiled down to the basic elements of narcissism: pride and selfishness. He isn't simply concerned for his family's well-being, and how boring would that be for the audience? What we really want to see is what motivates Walt. That is that he wants to make a name for himself. When Hank offers to take care of his family upon his inevitable demise, Walt gets cockeyed fast and gets a lump in his throat. When his former lover and partner offers to pay for his health care, Walt selfishly refuses. The only times in the show that Walter shows compassion are for those that belong to him: his wife, his son, his brother-in-law, and Jesse, who he grows attached to because he will follow his orders and do what he says. He is largely responsible for molding Jesse into who he is. The destination is crystal clear, but the journey is even more magnificent. While shows like Sopranos and Mad Men arguably had higher peaks than Breaking Bad sustained that peak for so much longer, with the consensus being that each season got progressively deeper, tighter, and more involving. There's a certain something that made fans feel connected to the show in a way that few other classics ever have. That something that I'm talking about is pacing. This is what I think Breaking Bad does better than any show ever written, never made. This is why it is one of the greatest and most unique achievements in the history of television. See, what I always admired the most about a typical episode of Breaking Bad was how much attention to detail was paid, how every episode moved the plot forward, gave us insight into the method or madness of the principal characters, or offered an iconic moment or quote about badassery. Not a single episode seemed to exist out of place or for any other reason than continuing the story. The only episode that appears to be out of place is episode 30, the infamous Fly episode. The plot of this episode is minimal in nature, but what it reveals to us about the characters and the foreboding of trouble to come speaks volumes. Now, budgetary concerns were one of the main factors for it being such an isolated incident, as Vince Gilligan himself recalls. Gilligan noted that the limited setting and cast allowed for a slower pace and deeper exploration of character traits and motives. This is a quote from him. Even if financial realities didn't enter into it, I feel as a showrunner that there should be a certain shape and pace to each season, and the really high highs that you try to get at the end of the season, big dramatic moments of action and violence, big operatic moments you're striving for, I don't think would land as hard if you didn't have the moments of quiet that came before them. Quiet episodes make the tenser, more dramatic episodes pop even more than they usually would just by their contrast. But for the most part, I do believe the show is a beautiful silk web, an intricate yarn spun. While Seinfeld was a show about nothing, or really the minutiae of daily life, Sopranos was one of the first shows to experiment with dream sequences, and Mad Men could spend entire episodes on philosophizing moral meditation, smoking, or just a lot of sex to fill the void. But Breaking Bad took the straight and narrow approach to storytelling. 62. 62 is the number of episodes long Breaking Bad is. 62 episodes to tell a story about one man's path to self-realization and his eventual downfall due to greed and selfishness. Compare that to The Sopranos' 86 or Mad Men's 92. As the great Roger Ebert once said, To paraphrase, like all great TV shows, it seems too short. Every episode started with a cold open, usually in medias res or a jump forward or backward in time to show something that will foreshadow ill will to come, or something to teach us a valuable lesson. This grabs our interest immediately and sets the tone for what will happen next. Every episode is simply a continuation and the aftermath of the episode preceding, and this level of focus is key for the creation of dread and the maintenance of tension. Whether viewed over a period of years or binge watched in a few days, this show was tailor-made to keep you glued onto the edge of your seat. No show has better continuity or more kinetic flow. Consider the smallest details of the show that were paid great attention, like Hank's recovery time and the limp that he walks with for the rest of the show after his near-fateful shooting. They made a 5-year process feel like it was in real time. Does part of this perception owe to the novelty of binge watching? Maybe, but even years later after rewatching it, I still find the focus as sharp as ever. Character development is another reason that we're so invested in this tale. We learn to empathize with some of the most lowly criminals just based on their relation to Walt's own insidiousness. He is the barometer that everything is measured by in the series. All good characters understand that first impressions are important and you can only make them once. But a great character often requires more than just an introduction. They need the scenes that tell us who they really are. Consider two such pivotal moments from two key characters. First, in the episode Full Measure. After the show has planted clues to make us speculate about who Mike really is and what he is capable of, we see the full extent of his talents. More than just a cleaner, he's a Terminator. The brilliant match cut of Mike seeing his granddaughter off with balloons on a blue sky with the seedy wetwork of the night sky confirms all we need to know about this man's fear. Similar to Walter, he has a family, but he must provide. I don't believe fear to be an effective motivator, says Gus Fring at one point during the show when he's trying to get Walter to cook. But this is exactly his message to Walt and Jesse when he quietly and methodically slits Victor's throat in the episode Box Cutter. Outwardly, Gus is sophisticated, personable, insofar as he has to be in his profession, and even conciliatory, but inwardly, he is calculated, cold, and ruthless. The way he disposes of his arch enemies and cuts out the middlemen with the cartel is pure evil genius. And a third example, I suppose, could be pretty much any time Saul Goodman gets the truth beat out of him. But Mike is a stand-up guy, perhaps blinded by the connection he develops with Jesse, who undoubtedly reminds him of his own son. Every great anti-hero needs a hero, and that hero is Hank. Our first impression of Hank is that he's a loud, brash and cocky, stereotypical hot-headed, self-righteous cop, but we learn very quickly that he has fear as much as anyone, which brings him down to our level. Despite his tough guy persona, under his bravado, this fear he has eats away at him, but he perseveres, such as the time that he and his fellow DEA agents are ambushed. The DEA members get their arms and legs blown off, but Hank comes back to tend to their wounds. Or there's the time shortly before that when he killed Tuco. Or when he survived the standoff against the brutal cartel cousins and had to rehab for months just in order to walk again. All along, never giving up on nailing Heisenberg. Now, yes, granted, Walter was responsible in a big way for both his good fortune and his bad, but the defining moment of Hank Schrader was all of his own, when he tells his would-be killer that he won't beg, and that his name is not Hank, but Asac Schrader, the title that he's worked so hard in his career for, a career he took so seriously, a career fighting crime and catching guys even like his brother-in-law. The intertwined destinies of these characters is actually very Shakespearean, and the show paces itself, sprinkling some badass moments along the way, but saving the ultimate badass for last. Just some final thoughts before I wrap it up. I think Mike took too many half measures throughout the show, but other than that, he was one of the most genuine characters in all of Breaking Bad. Gus was the exact opposite. He was a master of disguise, always guarded in his action to carry out his motives. Consider his great speech to Walter about a man providing for his family in order to persuade Walt to cook for him. Or when he uses the impressionable Gale to learn Walt's formula, telling him that he has cancer and that he's just going to die off and he'll need a replacement. Or when he wines and dines Jesse, who he on multiple occasions had previously deemed a contemptible junkie. He does this just in order to take Jesse under his wing and groom him for the job of head chef. He gives Jesse important assignments to carry out, always keeping his enemies close. This dichotomy is why Gus grows to be one of the most menacing characters in television history, and why it's even more impressive that Walt manages to outsmart him in the end. But just as Mike brings Walt down to earth after he kills Gus, just because you killed Jesse James doesn't make you Jesse James. I always viewed Walter as a feeble old man in reality and just a mastermind in his own head. A lot of the most badass moments in the show, courtesy of Walter, always seemed like fluff to me, at least after my initial viewing. But now I see them as the result of a man so confident in his own cunning that only his oversight and overextending grasp could take him down. Walter was a genius, but he was also a coward. When he put his hat on to become Heisenberg, just like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, he could pull off the ultimate trick of perspective. He was both dead and alive, passive and persistent, the savior and the harbinger, the family man and the benefactor of self-importance, all at once. And it's this oscillation that might be the key to how we put up with all of the horrible things Walt does and still find a way to consciously root for him in the end. I believe this is because we see Walter as he sees himself. We accept the logical conclusion that the premise of the show gives unto us. We want to see everything break bad. Over the course of the show, Walt becomes the baddest, and he earns it. When he at long last confesses to Skylar that he did everything for himself and liked it, she breathes a sigh of relief, and so do we. We've been with him along this journey all the way. We deserve the truth. And we also really liked it. In the end, Walt may have truly lost, but Heisenberg won. He tore his family to shreds, lost their respect, and ruined his reputation as an honest man. But he left behind a legacy greater than any street cred. He got the money to his family. He avenged Hank's death by purging the neo-Nazi tribe, and ensured that his signature formula would never come about again, although it would be unforgettable in the mind's eye of anyone who ever tasted the azure blue sky. Most importantly, though, he physically and figuratively frees Jesse, the heart and soul of the series, the one character who endures the most and learns the most. Don Draper may or may not have found peace. Tony may or may not have gotten whacked. But those in Breaking Bad surely learn that the price that crime pays isn't worth it. But the serialized version of this is, and even long after it's over. The show hasn't aged a day in any important detail, and it's going to be a long time before something comes along to equal its epic tale of greed and close, careful study of character. In the end, we feel that we know Walter better and even feel for him, despite all of his terrible actions and their consequences. And this can only be described as the magic of storytelling.